The first thing Chagatai noticed wasn't the enemy. It was the silence. No horns, no shouted insults, no prayers carried on the wind. Just a narrow winter valley, white snow, dark pines crowding the slopes, and at the throat of it, a straight line of shields set so neatly it could have been a wall built by the land itself. Chagatai had spent his life in motion. On the steppe, the horizon is a promise. If you can see it, you can reach it. Your horse is your home. Your bow is your argument. Speed is your shield. Fear is something you use on other people. But here, in the forests of the Russ's lands, fear didn't behave the way it was supposed to. Across the valley stood Bjorn, an old commander with a winter-white beard stiff with frost, centered in the line like the nail that holds a door shut. He didn't look like a hero from a painted manuscript. He looked tired. Not weak, just tired the way men get tired when they've been awake for years. Behind Bjorn's line lay the frozen river. The ice was cracked and scuffed, half dusted with snow, half shining like glass. It would not forgive a retreat. Bjorn knew that when he chose this ground. He chose it anyway, because by the winter of 1240, choices were running out. The Mongol advance had rolled across the eastern lands with a kind of brutal efficiency that turned distance into a weapon. When rivers rose, they stopped being barriers and became roads. When winter came, it didn't slow the horsemen down, it sometimes helped them. Towns that once believed they were protected by geography learned a hard lesson. The enemy was now using the landscape better than they were. Bjorn had seen the Mongols before, years earlier, far to the south. He'd watched brave men break for the same reason brave men always break, not because they lacked courage, but because the fight stopped making sense. The Mongols didn't just win battles, they made opponents feel as if resistance was pointless, as if the outcome had already been decided somewhere in the sky. So when Bjorn gathered what remained of his fighters, hard men, Varangian-descended warriors, Rus retainers, veterans and youth mixed together, he didn't tell them they were going to defeat an empire. He told them something simpler. We're going to deny them choices. And that was the heart of his plan. Not strength, not numbers, not better steel. Control. A valley barely wide enough for a proper cavalry arc. Dense forest on both sides, strangling flanks. A gentle slope leading up to the shield wall, forcing any mounted push to compress as it climbs. And behind the defenders, that frozen river. Dangerous if they had to run, yes, but also a hard edge that made encirclement difficult. It was the kind of place where Mongol doctrine, so perfect on open ground, started to grind. Where speed couldn't breathe, where angles disappeared, where a cavalry army could be forced into a narrow argument it didn't want to have. Chagatai rode forward, just far enough to see faces between shield rims. He watched the line and felt something he would never say out loud to his men. These people didn't come here to win. They came here to refuse. Behind Chagatai, the Mongol column shifted, horses snorting, tack creaking, riders adjusting bowstrings and quivers with calm, practiced hands. Someone laughed softly, not because it was funny, but because laughter was armor. A younger warrior near the rear would already be imagining the story they'd tell that night. A small band of northerners had tried to stand in the way, and the horde had swept them aside. That was how the world usually worked. But Chagatai had survived long enough to distrust the easy story. He leaned toward a scout. How many? The scout swallowed. About 100 Noyan, maybe a few more. 100. Later, storytellers would turn that number into legend. 100 against 10,000, a wall against the sea. In the real winter of war, numbers blur. Columns split, units detach, scouts miscount in fog. But the impression was what mattered. A small force had planted itself in the road and dared a much larger one to pay for every step. Chagatai looked again at the shields. The defenders were not screaming, not begging, not even chanting. They stood in a silence so complete it seemed to swallow the sound of the valley itself. Their breath rose like pale smoke and vanished into the fog. Chagatai raised a gloved hand. The drums began. Deep, measured beats rolled forward, the sound designed to do a job before the first arrow ever flew. Mongol warfare was never only about weapons. It was about information. It was about controlling what the enemy believed was possible. The drum said, "You are already surrounded by our reputation." Bjorn didn't answer. No horns, no taunts, no war cry. Nothing. And in that nothing, something small broke loose inside Chagatai's certainty. The Mongols had crossed half the world and found every kind of enemy. Enemies that prayed, enemies that shouted, enemies that charged to prove their honor. Noise was normal. Noise was human. But silence like this? Silence felt deliberate. Chagatai edged forward another pace, and for a moment the valley narrowed into a private conversation between two commanders. He let Bjorn see the bow at his side, the compact, compide curve that had ended so many arguments at a distance. It wasn't a threat spoken in words. It was a statement of method. This is what we do. Bjorn's answer wasn't a weapon. It was the formation itself. Then do it here. Bjorn's horse breathed out a thick plume.
The cold air bit through the seams of leather and fur. Somewhere in the trees, a branch creaked under snow. Time moved strangely in winter battles. Every second felt long, but the day itself would vanish quickly, and the forest did not forgive delay. Bjorn knew the north was different. The steppe teaches you distance. The forest teaches you doubt. Routes that looked simple on a map became traps of mud, snow, and narrow corridors. Supply was harder, communication was harder. If you wasted time, the season would punish you. He had options. He could try to break them with arrows and patience. He could attempt to bypass the valley and keep his column moving north. Or he could commit to forcing this choke point, because leaving an enemy behind you in forests like these was a knife waiting for your back. Bjorn understood that calculation too. That was part of why he stood here. He wasn't just blocking a road, he was creating a problem Chagatai couldn't ignore. A raven crossed the gray sky, wings cutting cleanly through mist. Bjorn watched it without turning his head. In another age, men would have called it an omen. In this moment, Bjorn treated it like a reminder. Nature would be here long after banners rotted. Bjorn watched the shields again and felt the valley's shape pressing on him. His favorite advantage, space, was being strangled. The forest walls and the slope didn't care how famous his empire was. They didn't care how many victories were behind him. They only cared about physics. And physics was quietly leaning toward the men who had already accepted they might not leave. Bjorn's shoulders rose and fell slowly. He didn't need to tell his men a speech. He trained them for this moment, to keep their feet planted, to lock their shields, to resist the one instinct that ruins so many defenders, the urge to chase. Because the Mongols fed on pursuit. Bjorn had seen it. He'd watched lines break when riders pretended to flee. He'd watched brave men step into open ground just to prove they weren't afraid, only to be surrounded and erased. So Bjorn built his line like a closed fist and made one rule sacred: do not take the bait. Bjorn's soldiers waited for the usual reaction, for shouting, for panic, for movement. But the defenders remained like carved wood, as if the valley had grown its own barrier overnight. The drums continued. The wind shifted. Mist rolled between the armies like a curtain drawn slowly across a stage. Chagatai inhaled and tasted cold iron. He didn't like this silence. Silence meant the enemy was thinking. And if the enemy was thinking, if an old commander in mail and fur had chosen this place on purpose, then Chagatai wasn't facing desperation alone. He was facing design. He lifted his hand again, higher this time, and his front ranks responded with calm practice. Bows came up, strings tightened, horses steadied, their breath rising in thick clouds. Across the valley, Bjorn's men adjusted without a sound. Shields angled, feet planted, spear held just out of sight behind the wooden wall. Two different worlds, two different doctrines brought to the same narrow throat of land. And in that frozen valley, the empire that lived on speed prepared to speak, only to find its words would have to pass through a doorway built from silence.
Before we go any further into that valley, it helps to understand what Chagatai actually brought with him. Because it wasn't just men on horses, it was a system, an entire way of war that had already rewritten the rules from the edges of China to the borders of Europe. From a modern point of view, the Mongol advantage in the 13th century wasn't mystical, it was organizational, it was disciplined, it was repeatable, and it was terrifying because it worked on multiple levels at once. First, movement. On the open steppe, distance isn't a barrier, it's something you can manage. Mongol forces were built to keep moving when others had to stop. When possible, riders had spare mounts, so a soldier didn't have to grind one horse into exhaustion. If you've ever watched a modern unit win simply by arriving faster, you already understand the idea. Operational tempo is a weapon. It lets you choose where fights happen, when they happen, and whether they happen at all. Second, range. The composite bow wasn't magic, but it was a masterpiece of practical engineering, compact enough to use from the saddle, strong enough to keep enemies under pressure before they could respond. The real advantage wasn't some legendary single shot. It was consistency. It was thousands of trained hands doing the same thing, in rhythm, again and again, until an enemy made a mistake. And third, psychology. This is the part most people remember, because it's the part that leaves scars on memory. The Mongols didn't rely on fear as a side effect, they used it like a tool. They cultivated a reputation so heavy that cities surrendered before the first arrow ever flew. They punished resistance hard enough that the next town down the road would think twice. In modern terms, it was information warfare, except it traveled by refugees, by merchants, by smoke on the horizon. And Chagatai had grown up inside that machine. To him, war wasn't chaos, war was a method. You scout, you probe, you pressure. You make the enemy react emotionally. You draw them out with a retreat that isn't real. You break their formation, then you take the space they can't defend anymore. The Mongols didn't have to be the bravest men on the field. They just had to stay coordinated longer than their opponent. Most enemies played their part in that script. They panicked, they chased, they broke into individuals, and individuals are easy to manage. That's why the valley felt wrong to Chagatai from the very beginning, because Beidron wasn't acting like a man inside the Mongol story. He wasn't giving Chagatai the reactions he was trained to harvest. If you want a simple modern comparison, think about an opponent who refuses to be provoked, refuses to overextend, refuses to speed up just because you want them to. That kind of discipline is deeply frustrating, and it's dangerous because it forces you to fight the problem directly instead of manipulating it. And then there was the environment. The steppe teaches you space, the forest teaches you friction. In open country, cavalry can breathe. You can widen your arc, surround, threaten from multiple angles, and keep the enemy guessing. In tight terrain, between trees, snowbanks, slopes, and frozen ruts, horses become less like weapons and more like vehicles stuck on a narrow road. You can still shoot, you can still push, but your angles shrink, your timing slows, communication becomes harder, every decision takes longer to execute. In modern language, your decision cycle slows down. You observe, you orient, you decide, you act, and the environment drags each step like a weight. Chagatai didn't need modern terms to feel it. He felt it in his horse's careful footing. He felt it in the way his front ranks couldn't spread cleanly. He felt it in the cold that seeped into leather and made fingers stiffer, slower. And he felt it most of all in the silence coming from Beidron's line, because Mongol intimidation was theater with a purpose. Drums, banners, the visible confidence of a force that had already been winning for years. Those things were meant to start the collapse inside the enemy before the battle even began. But Beidron's one didn't collapse. They didn't even speak. They stood there like they were waiting for weather. That kind of stillness does something strange to a soldier's mind. It makes you wonder what you're missing. It makes you question whether your enemy knows something you don't. Across the region, fear had been moving ahead of Chagatai like a storm front. Villages emptied, roads filled with refugees hauling what they could. In wooden halls, people listened to messengers and stared at the floor because eye contact felt too heavy. This is how the Mongol machine usually worked. By the time the riders arrived, half the victory had already happened inside the enemy's imagination. But Beidron had heard those stories too, and instead of letting them poison him, he used them like intelligence. He understood what most defenders didn't. The Mongols weren't unstoppable because they were supernatural. They were unstoppable because opponents kept giving them what they needed: open space, panic, pursuit, and mistakes. So Beidron made a different offer. He offered Chagatai a fight inside a narrow doorway, on cold ground, where speed couldn't stretch out, and where the only way forward was to pay for every step. That's why the frozen river mattered. To an untrained eye, it looked like Beidron had trapped himself. A wall behind his back, no retreat, no escape. But to Beidron, it was an anchor. It meant Chagatai couldn't simply flow around the line in a wide circle. It meant the geometry of the valley forced the Mongols to approach head-on. It turned the battlefield into a funnel. And if you're holding a funnel, you don't need to be everywhere. You only need to be unbreakable in one place. Chagatai, meanwhile, had to decide how to solve a problem his doctrine didn't like. He could sit back and keep shooting, slowly wearing them down. That was the method. But time in the northern forests is never neutral. Every hour spent in a narrow valley is an hour you're not moving. Every hour is more feed consumed, more fatigue, more risk of a thaw that turns roads into mud. Winter can be an ally, but it can also be a deadline. He could bypass the valley, find another route, keep the column moving north. But bypassing in forests is not like bypassing on the steppe. Detours aren't clean, they're slow, they're uncertain. And leaving a hostile force behind you in this terrain is a gamble. Those men don't have to defeat you in open battle. They can harass your scouts, hit your supply animals, pick off stragglers, and vanish between the trees. So Chagatai's choices narrowed, even as his army dwarfed Beidron's. That's a key point, and it's one modern audiences often miss. Sometimes having more options is more important than having more men. In that valley, Beidron was taking options away. Chagatai rode along his line, studying the choke point again and again. He watched the forest walls like a man judging the width of a door he wants to force open. He watched his riders try to form wider arcs and saw the trees refuse them. He watched the icy patches pull at hooves and felt the smallest signs of hesitation ripple backward. Hesitation is contagious. So is confidence. And right now, the confidence wasn't spreading the way it usually did. Back at the shield wall, Beidron was doing what good commanders do in any era: reducing chaos, managing fatigue, keeping men in the mindset where the formation matters more than the individual impulse. He didn't need speeches, he needed timing. He rotated positions in small increments, the way modern units rotate watch and guard duties. He kept the center anchored, he kept the line tight, he made sure no one chased. Because to chase the Mongols is to accept their rules. Beidron's whole plan was to deny those rules, and Chagatai could feel it. He could feel that this wasn't just stubbornness, it was design. The longer the standoff lasted, the more the valley itself became a third commander, quietly shaping the battle before it truly began. Fog thickened, drifted, and thinned again, like the land was breathing between them. Horses steamed in the cold, leather creaked, shields held, bows remained ready. Two worlds faced each other across a narrow strip of frozen ground. Chagatai had brought speed, range, and fear, the three pillars that had crushed so many enemies. Beidron answered with something the Mongols rarely encountered in a form they couldn't manipulate: terrain, discipline, and silence. And as that winter light slid forward toward noon, Chagatai began to understand the most dangerous truth of the day. This wasn't going to be a story where the empire simply arrives and the world moves aside. In this valley, someone had decided to stop the script.
The first volley came without drama.
just a clean, disciplined release. 5,000 bowstrings snapped forward almost as one, and the gray morning sky filled with dark lines that seemed to hang there for a breath before they started falling. In the fog and cold, it didn't look like the end of the world. It looked like something worse, a practiced routine. Bajorn didn't shout. He didn't wave his arms. He didn't make a speech. He simply lifted his shield, and his men lifted theirs with him. Front rank first, then the next, overlapping like shingles on a roof. It wasn't panic, it was muscle memory. Wood and iron rose into place, and the first impacts arrived like heavy rain on a barn. Thuds, splinters, the dry bite of iron on oak. A few arrows found soft places, an arm that shifted at the wrong moment, a thigh exposed beneath a coat, a gap at the edge of a shield. Men grunted and tightened their teeth, but nobody broke. Nobody stepped out of line. The shield wall held its shape the way a well-built bridge holds its shape, not by being unbreakable, but by distributing force. Chagatai watched carefully from behind his front ranks. This was supposed to be the easy part. Most armies did the same thing under sustained archery. They started arguing with themselves. Someone would step back. Someone would flinch. Someone would decide the formation wasn't worth it anymore. And once a formation starts to unravel, the Mongols don't have to win in the heroic sense. They simply harvest the disorder. So Chagatai ordered another volley, and another. The valley filled with the steady rhythm of it. Draw, release, impact, until the Russ's shields began to look like they'd sprouted wooden thorns. But the lines stayed quiet. The men stayed close. Their breathing rose in pale clouds over their helmets, and the clouds drifted away into fog like the valley itself was exhaling. That silence was unsettling. Fear usually had a sound. Fear was loud. Fear shouted. Fear prayed. This was different. At mid-morning, Chagatai tried a different tool. Not more arrows, but temptation. A small detachment of riders pushed forward at a canter, loosed a few arrows at close range, then wheeled away in a clean, confident turn. It was the classic invitation. In the steppe, it worked because it exploited something universal, the human need to respond. An enemy sees riders retreating and thinks, now. Pride follows, anger follows, the urge to prove you're not afraid follows. A line steps out, turns into a cluster, and then the Mongols do what they do best. Stretch the fight across open ground until the enemy can't hold itself together. The riders pulled back into the fog as if to say, come on then. Bajorn didn't move. A younger man near the center, Hakon, shoulders tense, breath sharp behind his helmet, shifted as if to step out. You could see it in his stance. You could see the thought building in him. They're mocking us. They're leaving. This is the moment. Bajorn didn't look at him. He didn't need to. In a calm voice, just loud enough for Hakon to hear, Bajorn said, hold. That single word carried more weight than any war cry. Because Bajorn understood something that most men only learn by losing. The Mongols wanted your feet to move more than they wanted your blood. They wanted you to stop being a wall and start being a crowd. So the shield wall stayed put, the bait hung in the air, unanswered, and then vanished into fog with nothing to show for it. On the Mongol side, the frustration didn't explode. It seeped. The riders came back, circling, searching for angles, but the forest pinched their movement. The valley wouldn't let them spread. The best shooting lanes remained straight ahead into the shields, and the ground, cold, slick, uneven, was starting to speak as well. As the morning wore on, sunlight fought through cloud in thin patches. It wasn't warm, but it was enough to change the top layer of the snow in places, enough to create that treacherous glaze where packed snow turns to something like glass. A scout's horse tested it, slipped, recovered, and then refused to step forward with the same confidence. A small moment, almost nothing, but Chagatai noticed. On open ground, cavalry is freedom. In a narrow, icy funnel, cavalry is risk. Every hesitation compresses the riders behind it. Every slip turns a clean approach into a knot. Chagatai rode forward a few paces and studied the defenders more closely. 50 yards of shields, tight as a door shut in a storm. Spear tips barely visible. Men breathing in rhythm, eyes forward. Not brave in the heroic sense, disciplined in the terrifying sense. It made him wonder briefly whether this was brilliance or suicide. Then he chose to test it with force. Not a full commitment, not yet. A probing push, just enough weight to see whether the wall would bend into a gap. The riders advanced uphill in a controlled trot, but the funnel narrowed them. They were forced closer together as they climbed.
Horses, cautious on slick patches, shortened their strides. The sound of hoofs became less like thunder and more like grinding pressure, snow and ice breaking under weight. At the last moment, Bejon gave a small signal, not a shout, not a banner wave, just a controlled gesture that his men understood because they trained for this exact second. Spear points apparent above shield rims, angled low and steady, not theatrical, not reckless. They weren't aiming at a rider's chest. They were claiming space. They were telling the horses, you don't own this lane. The lead mounts balked. Not dramatically, just enough. One horse feared a half step into another. A rider's alignment broke. The pressure behind them increased, and suddenly that clean approach compressed into something messy. In a narrow pass, mess spreads fast. Then the push hit the shield wall. Wood groaned, leather straps stretched, boots slit a fraction in packed snow. The defenders absorbed the shove with bent knees and locked shoulders. Each man braced into the next like beams in a single structure. The wall flexed, but it didn't open. That was the key difference between a formation and a crowd. A crowd reacts as individuals. A formation reacts as one body. Inside the press, Mongol riders tried to find a seam, but the forest and snowbanks denied lateral space. The slope denied clean speed. The spear points denied the last few feet of comfort. Riders hesitated at the worst moment, and horses, living animals, not machines, refused to gamble themselves into sharp resistance. Bejon's men answered with short, controlled actions. Spears nudged forward and withdrew. Shields shifted to maintain overlap. Nobody overextended, nobody broke the line to chase a single rider. They didn't fight for a dramatic victory, they fought to keep the doorway closed. After a minute that felt longer, the probing group began to disengage, carefully, backing and turning with caution, because on that slick ground retreat itself could become a fall. They pulled away, and the shield wall reset like nothing had happened. That was when Chagotay's face changed. Not anger, not fear, something colder, recognition. He had learned the shape of the problem now. Arrow pressure wasn't collapsing them. The feigned retreat wasn't pulling them out. Probing contact wasn't producing cracks. Bejon wasn't giving him what he needed. And the longer this lasted, the more the valley worked against Mongol strengths. The fog swallowed distances, the forest strangled flanking movement, the ice punished momentum. Even the sound behaved differently here. Drums didn't roll the same way between trees, and silence felt heavier. Chagotay rode back along his line, eyes moving from terrain to men to the shield wall and back again. His unit leaders gathered close, breath steaming, gesture straight and efficient. No theatrics, just the short language of professionals trying to solve a stubborn equation. You could see what was happening in his mind. If he sat back and kept shooting, time would punish him. Arrows would be spent, horses would tire. The northern roads would get worse, not better. If he bypassed the valley, he risked leaving a hard knot of defenders behind him, exactly the kind of knot that can harass a column in forest for days. So his choices narrowed toward the one choice that pride and doctrine always prefer: break the wall by mass. He began to gather heavier riders, tighter ranks, deeper formation. A push meant not to test, but to force. Across the valley, Bejon watched the reshaping of the enemy line and understood it instantly. He didn't smile, he didn't relax. If anything, his shoulders settled lower, as if preparing to carry more weight. He looked down his own line, quiet faces behind shield rings, breath clouds drifting upward, men holding themselves together by deatherplin resin without over. And he made the same decision he'd been making all morning. Hold, don't chase, deny them the story they want. In that moment, the valley stopped being a battlefield and became what Bejon intended from the start: a narrow doorway where the Mongols could not be allowed to turn the fight into open ground. Chagotay's riders tightened their formation in the fog, Bejon's spears lowered behind the shields, and the air between them, cold, wet, and heavy, filled with the feeling of a larger collision about to arrive.
By late morning, the valley stopped feeling like a place and started feeling like a machine. The fog sat low along the ground, and the pale winter sun hung behind thin cloud like a coin pressed into cloth. The pine forest on both sides didn't just frame the battlefield, it squeezed it. Every trunk, every snowbank, every root hidden under drifted white narrowed the choices for anyone on horseback. Bjorn stood in the center of his line and watched the approach lanes the way a craftsman watches his work. He wasn't staring at banners or faces. He was reading the ground, the slope, the icy patches, the narrow channels where horses would be forced to bunch together. Behind him, the frozen river gleamed in dull light. It wasn't a comforting backdrop, it was a hard boundary. Retreat across that ice would be a gamble, and Bjorn knew it. But it also meant the enemy couldn't simply flow around his flanks. No wide circle, no easy encirclement. If the Mongols wanted through, they had to come through the throat of the valley. And Chagotay, on the far side of the mist, was beginning to understand what that meant. He could feel it in the way his front ranks could not spread cleanly. He could see it in the way the forest denied the wide arcs his doctrine preferred. He could hear it in the quieter, tighter sound of hooves on slick snow, less thunder, more grinding pressure. So he chose to change the equation. The Mongol formation tightened at the valley mouth. Riders drew closer, reins shortened, weight shifted forward in saddles. This wasn't the loose, flowing posture of mounted archers controlling distance. This was a deliberate, heavy push meant to force the break. From far away, it looked impressive, organized, confident, inevitable. But Bjorn saw the problem hidden inside it. The valley was narrowing them into a single lane. A charge on open ground can breathe. A charge in a funnel compresses like water through a narrow pipe.
The tighter it gets, the less room there is for correction, and on ice, correction is everything. Chagatai watched as the assault group moved from a controlled walk into a guarded trot. Even then, the horses didn't move like they were on the steppe. Their hooves tested the ground. Their stride shortened where the snow glazed into glass. Riders adjusted constantly, doing the quiet work of staying upright and keeping spacing, because spacing was already collapsing. Bjorn didn't respond with noise. He responded with posture. The shield wall lowered its center of gravity. Boots ground into packed snow for traction. The front rank pressed shoulder to shoulder until gaps disappeared, and at Bjorn's smallest signal, spear points rose into view, low, steady, and aligned. It wasn't a dramatic flourish, it was a message to the horses. This lane is not yours. The first mounts hesitated, not enough for a storyteller to call it fear, but enough to disrupt clean geometry. One horse feared a half-step, bumping another. A rider's alignment broke. The pressure behind them tightened, and suddenly the front of that inevitable push became a crowded knot at the worst possible moment. Then contact came, not as a cinematic crash, but as a brutal shove of mass into wood. Shields groaned, leather straps stretched. Snow dust burst from under boots. The line bent, just slightly, like a door under a strong shoulder. And for a heartbeat, you could feel the moment where an army decides whether it will hold together or become individuals. Bjorn prevented the decision from happening at all. He stayed calm. He held his shield steady. His men felt that steadiness and copied it. The force traveled through the wall, dispersed by bodies locked together like beams, and the formation stabilized again. Inside the press, Mongol riders tried to find a seam. They angled for openings, but the forest walls were too close and the snowbanks too high. There was no lateral room to exploit. Weapons that worked beautifully in open space became awkward in the crush. Lances and bows had to be handled carefully just to avoid tangling with friendly riders. And meanwhile, Bjorn's spear line did what it was designed to do. It denied comfort. Short, controlled thrusts, never overextended, kept horses from settling into a clean push. The spears weren't chasing kills. They were enforcing a boundary, telling the enemy inch by inch that this doorway would not open. Chagatai watched the push stall. He could feel time slipping. Winter campaigns don't forgive wasted hours. Every delay feeds fatigue. Every pause consumes forage and patience. And in forests like these, you can't assume you'll find a clean detour. So he called the riders back. The withdrawal itself showed how wrong the ground had become for horses. Backing and turning on slick snow is careful work. Hoof scrape, body shift, riders fight for balance. A retreat is never free on terrain like this. When the Mongols disengaged, Bjorn's wall reset almost immediately. Shields relocked, spear butts receded into snow, breathing stabilized. It was as if the wall itself had a memory and returned to shape the moment pressure lifted. Chagatai rode closer again, studying the choke point like a man staring at a locked gate. He could bypass it, yes, but not cleanly. And he could keep shooting, yet his best advantage, the wide arcs of mounted archery, was suffocating inside trees and fog. Many angles simply didn't exist. His options were narrowing, even though his numbers were greater. This is one of the strangest truths of war. The side with more men can still feel boxed in if terrain and discipline steal its choices. Bjorn knew that. He built his plan around it.
The second push came harder. Not because the Mongols suddenly became reckless, but because they shifted tools. The riders tightening in the valley mouth weren't there to test anymore. They were there to force a decision, right now, before winter, fatigue, and doubt could do their work. Bjorn felt it before the impact even arrived. You can always feel it if you've stood in a line long enough. The sound changes, the rhythm tightens, the ground starts to tremble in a different way. The enemy isn't asking questions anymore. He's trying to make you answer with your body. The shove hit the shield wall, and for a breath the center bowed. Not much, just enough to make every man in that line sense the edge of failure. This is the moment most formations die. Not when they're losing badly, but when they're only almost losing. When the brain offers you a reasonable bargain, step back, break the line, save yourself. Bjorn didn't bargain. Hold, he said. Quiet, flat, like stating the weather. And then he did the one thing that matters in every century of warfare. He stepped into the worst pressure himself. He didn't leap forward like a hero in a song. He shifted half a pace and took the weight into his own shoulder, into his own shield, into his own stance. Under mail and wet cloth, that small movement cost him. His boots slid a fraction in packed snow and then bit down again, but his men felt it. Leadership doesn't always sound like a speech. Sometimes it's just a commander's body saying, "We are not moving." The line stabilized. The bend stopped. The wall became a wall again. Behind the shields, spear points started to work. Not with wild thrusts, not with men lunging out of formation, but with short, controlled motions designed to deny space. To tell horses again and again that this lane was hostile, to force riders to hesitate at the exact moment they wanted momentum. And the valley helped, quietly, like a third ally no one could bribe. The slope compressed the attackers, the forests erased flanking angles, the slick patches turned bravery into risk. The charge didn't blossom outward like it would on open ground, it folded inward, tighter and tighter, until a push became a crowded press. Chagatai saw it with the cold clarity of a professional. He'd broken shield walls before. He knew what they were supposed to do under pressure. They were supposed to become ragged at the edges. They were supposed to open a seam. They were supposed to produce a mistake he could exploit. Bjorn gave him none of it. So Chagatai shifted again. He brought archers closer. In open terrain, Mongol archery is a wide net. Here it became a needle, close range, narrow angles, shots aimed into the tiny spaces between shield rents, around elbows, under arms. Not glamorous, just practical. Arrows struck wood. Some struck the ground. A few found flesh. Men flinched because they were human, but the formation did not react like a crowd. It reacted like a structure. When one man stumbled, the shields beside him slid and overlapped tighter. When someone dropped to a knee, another stepped in by inches to fill the gap. No shouting, no panic, just the silent language of drilled movement. From a modern point of view, this is where battles are really decided. Formations don't fail because the enemy is powerful. They fail because internal disorder spreads. The Mongols were trying to inject disorder, fear, gaps, noise, anything that would make Bjorn's men start acting as individuals instead of parts of a whole. Bjorn's job wasn't to be the strongest man in the line. It was to keep the line from becoming 100 separate fights. And then Chagatai tried fire. Not as a fantasy weapon, not as a miracle, just as disruption. A few burning bundles, a few flaming shafts, enough to force movement. Fire makes people reach for it. Fire makes them step back. Fire makes them break their own spacing. A shield caught and began to smoke along its edge. Someone yanked a strap loose and tossed the shield aside. For a breath, the center showed daylight where there should have been wood. That heartbeat is all an army needs, if the defending commander freezes. Bjorn didn't freeze. He moved into the gap himself, smoke drifting across his frost beard. Not to look brave, but because he understood the math of cohesion. A gap isn't just a hole, it's a story. It tells men we're coming apart. So he denied that story immediately. A replacement shield slid in, another defender stepped forward, snow was thrown onto the smoldering cloth. The wall reformed so cleanly it was almost insulting. Across the valley, Mongol riders began to glance at each other. Their eyes were no longer asking, how long until these men break? They were asking, why aren't they breaking? And that question is dangerous. Because once soldiers stop trusting method and start searching for explanation, superstition walks in. Bjorn fought the shift. Not as panic, Mongol discipline was too strong for that, but as a change in tone, a sense that time was no longer working for him. He rode forward closer than before, trying to end the uncertainty by sheer presence, to remind his troops that the Empire was still the Empire, that the story still belonged to them. That's when he saw Bjorn's calm up close. An old man, shoulders heavy with mail and winter, eyes steady as stone, not excited, not angry, simply unwilling to move. Bjorn spoke, briefly, controlled, offering the defenders a way out, a promise that if they stepped aside, they didn't have to vanish here. Bjorn answered evenly, no performance, no insult.
By early afternoon, the valley had changed. It wasn't just snow anymore. It was churned slush, scraped ice, and deep hoof marks that filled with thin meltwater and froze again. Every step became heavier. Every shift of weight mattered more. The air itself felt thicker, fog hanging low, breath clouds stacking on top of breath clouds, until the space between the two forces looked like a living thing. Bjorn stood with his shield wall still intact, but you could see the cost in the smallest details. Shoulders rising a little slower, hands tightening around straps a little longer, men blinking hard to keep focus. This wasn't the clean, bright tension of morning. This was endurance, measured in minutes, in breaths, in the ability to stay organized when your body is begging you to stop. And Bjorn knew something else too. The Mongols could rotate fresh riders forward. They could keep pressure coming in disciplined waves. That was part of what made them so dangerous. But the valley was taking its own payment from them. Horses were tiring faster than they should. The ground was stealing traction. The forest was stealing angles. And in a fight like this, the environment doesn't care which banner you ride under. Across the fog, Chaghatay's archers tried to keep the rhythm going. Draw, release, reset. It was the heartbeat of Mongol warfare. But now their movements looked slightly different. Quivers sat lighter on saddles, and the pauses between volleys grew just a little longer. A few riders dismounted to retrieve arrows where they could, carefully bending in stiff armor, pulling shafts from frozen ground with the slow effort of someone doing unpleasant work in the cold. That alone tells you a lot. When a force that normally wins with effortless motion is forced into recovery and scavenging, the tempo starts to slip. Bjorn watched that happen without changing his face. He didn't need to celebrate it. He just needed to recognize it. Because this was the core of his plan from the start. Don't try to outmatch the Mongols in open-field brilliance. Make them spend resources. Make them spend time. Make the road north feel expensive. Along his own line, Bjorn began rotating men with quiet precision. A tired shield-bearer stepped back. Another stepped in. Not dramatically. No scrambling, no shouting. Just controlled replacement, like a door hinge being reinforced before the next shove. On the Mongol side, the pressure continued, but it was no longer the clean confidence of earlier. Riders started speaking to each other more. You could see quick glances thrown toward the silent wall, then away again, like the men didn't want to admit what they were thinking. When soldiers stop trusting method and start looking for meaning, fear changes shape. It stops being the fear of death, which professionals can manage. It becomes the fear of the unknown, the fear that the script has changed. Chaghatay felt it too. He rode along his front, scanning the ground and the defenders, reading the valley like a problem he didn't enjoy solving. He'd tried patience, he'd tried bait, he'd tried pressure, he'd tried weight, and the wall was still there. So he reached for disruption. Fire. Not a miracle, not a fantasy weapon, just the oldest trick in war. Make the enemy move when the enemy wants to stay still. Attendants brought small braziers forward, shielded from wind. Oil-soaked cloth was wrapped around shafts. Sparks rose and vanished into fog. The lit arrowheads glowed like tiny moving suns against the gray. Even the horses didn't like it. Animals understand fire in a way men sometimes forget. They shifted and snorted, breath mixing with smoke. Then the fire arrows went up. Through the mist, you could barely see the arc. You saw the smoke trail first, then the flicker, then the impact, thudding into shields, skittering onto snow, smoldering where cloth straps and wood met. Along one section of Bjorn's wall, a shield edge began to smoke. A defender ripped a strap loose and tossed the shield aside. For a heartbeat, a gap opened, just a narrow slice of daylight where there should have been solid wood. That heartbeat is what the Mongols lived for, that tiny moment when formation turns into individual reaction. Bjorn denied them that moment. He stepped into the gap himself, smoke washing across his beard, and drove his own shield edge into alignment with a short, brutal shove. Another man slid forward. Snow was thrown onto the smoldering cloth. A cloak was pressed down to smother the ember. The wall sealed again with the same quiet discipline it had shown all day. The fire hadn't broken them. It had only proven something, to both sides. To Bjorn's men, it proved the line could survive chaos. To Chaghatay's men, it proved the line wasn't reacting like a normal human enemy. And that's when you start seeing the real battlefield, inside the mind. A few Mongol riders began to look unsettled, not panicked, not disobedient, just uncertain. Their hands checked their gear twice. Their eyes kept flicking to the fog. Their confidence, the Empire's most reliable weapon, started slipping not cleanly. Chaghatay understood that if he let that uncertainty grow, it would infect everything. So he did what commanders often do when morale becomes fragile. He gathered his closest heavy riders. He pulled his guard tighter. He prepared a center strike, direct, forceful, aimed at the point where leadership lives. If he could crack the hinge of Bjorn's formation, the wall might still fall the old-fashioned way, by internal disorder. Bjorn saw the shift through the fog, a tighter cluster, standards aligning, riders packing too close. It was the shape of a decapitation attempt, even in medieval clothing. So he thickened his center by inches. Men slid in from adjacent files. Shields overlapped deeper. Spear butts reseated into packed snow. No grand movement, just the quiet engineering of survival. Then Bjorn did something that hit Chaghatay's force harder than any weapon. He advanced. Not a charge, not a reckless surge. 2 slow steps. One, then another. An entire shield wall moving forward like a closing door.
Boots sank into slush with heavy certainty. Shield rims scraped over embedded arrow shafts. Spears stayed low and controlled. It was an inversion of what the Mongols expected. Infantry wasn't supposed to take space under that kind of pressure. Infantry was supposed to either hold and crumble, or chase and die. But Bjorn's wall did neither. It moved forward with the pace of something inevitable, not fast, not wild, just unstoppable in a way that made the fog feel suddenly smaller. The Mongol front line backed a half step. Horses, already uncomfortable in churned ice and slush, responded to the pressure with instinct. Riders steadied them, but the moment had landed. This is where the story started shifting from, how do we break them, to, what are they? Along Bjorn's line, men began a low chant. Not a spell, not magic, just rhythm. A shared breath turned into a shared voice. In cold air, human sound carries strangely, and in a foggy valley, it feels like the land is speaking with you. Chagatai rode forward into clearer view, spear lifted, trying to restore the old certainty. He pointed toward the center like a commander pointing at the one problem that must be solved. Behind him, elite riders aligned into a tight punch. Bjorn, at the heart of the advancing wall, steadied the pace with a subtle hand motion. He prevented overextension. He kept the line from becoming a surge, because he knew the most dangerous thing in the world right now was not Mongol steel. It was impatience. The ground between them had become a trap of its own. Slush sucked at hooves. Ice stole traction. The forest still denied flanks. Any attempt to widen out simply folded back toward the center. In other words, the valley kept doing what Bjorn asked it to do, force the Mongols into the one kind of fight they liked the least. A tight, grinding collision, where balance mattered more than speed. The fog thickened again as both sides closed. Breath and smoke and winter air mixed into a single curtain. Standards trembled in the wind. Shields braced. Horses snorted and stamped. And in that narrowing center lane, Chagatai committed himself forward, because now it wasn't just about the road. It was about whether the Mongols could still make the world believe they were inevitable. Bjorn planted his feet, settled his shoulders under the weight of mail and winter, and held the center as the next decisive collision began.
The fog thickened as the center lanes closed. By now, the valley floor wasn't snow so much as a churned mix of slush and ice, ground that grabbed at boots and stole traction from hooves. Every movement had weight. Every correction cost effort. And in a place like that, the fight stops being about speed and starts being about balance. Chagatai's elite center group came forward again, packed tight by the funnel of trees and snowbanks. You could feel the pressure building before they even reached the shields, horses steaming, riders leaning in, standards trembling behind them. This wasn't a probe, this was a commitment. Bjorn watched the surge like a man watching a door being shouldered from the other side. He didn't look away, he didn't shout. He simply tightened the hinge, thickened the center by inches, kept shields overlapping deeper, kept spear butts planted in snow so the front rank could hold without sliding. And then the hit landed. Wood groaned, leather straps stretched. The center of the shield wall bowed more than it had all day, and for a breath the formation looked like it might open, not because the men lacked courage, because physics doesn't care about courage. A mass of horses and riders pushing uphill in a tight lane can make even the strongest line flex. This is the moment armies usually lose themselves. When the wall bends, the mind starts bargaining. One step back feels reasonable. One glance to the side turns into two. A formation becomes a collection of individuals. And against the Mongols, individuals don't last long. Bjorn refused the bargain. He didn't call for glory. He didn't ask his men to be fearless. He did something far more practical. He stepped into the pressure point himself. Half a pace, maybe less, but it changed the geometry. It told the men beside him, without words, the center stays shut. His boots slid slightly on packed snow, then bit down again. His shoulders settled under the weight of mail and wet cloth. His shield edge locked into the neighbor's rim like a beam being braced. The wall stabilized, and then the trap began to close. Bjorn's formation didn't retreat, it folded inward. Not dramatically, just enough to swallow the riders who pushed too far into the center lane. The forest denied flanks, the snowbanks denied escape routes, the slush punished sudden turns. The farther the Mongols pressed, the tighter the space became around them. From above, it would have looked like a hinge working exactly as designed, a door that doesn't swing open, but swings shut around the shoulder pushing against it. Inside the press, it felt like the world shrank to arm's length.
Fog, breath, the hard smell of leather and wet wool, shield rims bumping, spear shafts sliding, horses trying to find footing where there wasn't any. Men shoved in from behind by forces they couldn't see. Bjorn moved through that crush with deliberate control. Not fast, there was no room for speed, but steady. He took position where the lane threatened to open, because he understood the real battlefield now. Not the valley, but cohesion. Chagatai, seeing the center knot tighten and feeling uncertainty ripple through the riders behind him, did what steppe commanders do when morale needs a spine. He came forward himself. It wasn't reckless, it was visible leadership, placing his body where his men could see it, reminding them the story still belonged to the horde. He advanced carefully through slush and ice, posture upright, reins tight, spear and saber ready, his guard closing around him in a tight cluster. And then, through the fog, inside the crush, the two commanders finally saw each other clearly. Bjorn on foot, shield up, axe in hand, frost in his beard, smoke residue still staining the wood, an old man by the calendar, but a dangerous one by intent. Chagatai mounted slightly higher, fur-trimmed lamella armor dull in gray light, eyes steady, jaw tight, a professional commander who had expected fear and found refusal instead. For a heartbeat, everything around them kept moving, but those two held a strange stillness. Chagatai spoke first, brief and controlled. Not a scream, not an insult. The kind of sentence a commander offers when he's still trying to solve the problem without paying for it in blood and morale. Bjorn answered evenly, without raising his voice. The kind of answer that doesn't negotiate. The kind of answer that says, this is what the ground is for. Then the moment collapsed back into action. Chagatai drew his saber in a short, efficient motion. No flourish, no showmanship. Just a clean strike in tight space, the way professionals move when there's no room for theater. Bjorn met it with the ox haft and the edge of his shield. Wood and metal connected with a hard, brutal sound. The impact traveled through Bjorn's arms into his shoulders, and you could see him absorb it with his stance more than his strength, shifting his weight a fraction to stay balanced in slush. They didn't duel like knights in open field. There was no elegant circling. This was closer to grappling, two men trying to control angles and space while the battlefield pressed in on them from every side. Chagatai's horse sidestepped under pressure, tack creaking, breath bursting into fog. Bjorn drove forward with his shield. Not a charge, just a shove. Short, powerful, grounded. The kind of movement that steals an opponent's balance in a cramped environment. And balance was everything here. For a split second, Chagatai's alignment broke. Not much, half a step, a minor shift, the kind of mistake that wouldn't matter on open ground. In the valley center lane, it mattered. Bjorn seized that fraction of initiative. He raised the axe and brought it down with decisive force. Nothing exaggerated, no impossible speed, just a veteran's timing and body mechanics working in the space the terrain allowed. Chagatai tried to meet it, but the angle was wrong, the footing was wrong, the press was wrong. The strike didn't land in a clean cinematic moment. It landed in the messy reality of packed bodies and slipping ground. Chagatai went down into the sash with a heavy fall, armor weight pulling him, horse recoiling a step, guards surging in. The valley changed in that instant. Not because every Mongol suddenly panicked, but because the story cracked. Soldiers closest to Chagatai hesitated for a heartbeat, just a heartbeat. And that hesitation spread outward like a ripple in water. Horses stopped shifting, riders glanced at each other. Discipline didn't vanish, but it stalled. And in warfare, a stall at the wrong moment can be more dangerous than fear. Chagatai's guard pushed forward through fog, trying to shield and extract him, their footing careful, movements urgent but controlled. They lifted and supported him with real effort, guiding him back to a safer spacing. Behind them, unit leaders began signaling withdrawal and regroup. Not a wild rout, something more unsettling for an empire built on confidence, a controlled retreat that still felt unfamiliar. Down the slope, Standard stepped, riders turned toward the forest corridor. Hoofs surged for grip in slush and ice, the column began to pull back into the trees. And Bjorn did the thing that completed the victory. He didn't chase. He held. That's the part most people struggle to understand, even today. When you see an enemy withdraw, every instinct screams to pursue. But Bjorn knew exactly what pursue would do. It would dissolve his wall into a crowd, carry his men onto open ground, and hand the Mongols their favorite kind of fight. So Bjorn raised his shield slightly, as if to say, stay closed. His men exhaled together, fog rising over helmet rims like a single cloud. And they relocked their formation. They sealed the center lane again. They kept the doorway shut. From the Mongol side, riders looked back through the mist at a line that wouldn't move, a wall that didn't celebrate, a wall that didn't chase, a wall that simply remained. And as the Mongol standards faded between the pine trunks, something deeper than casualties was carried away into the forest. A new thought. A dangerous one. That maybe the North could not be ruled by fear alone. That maybe, in the wrong place, on the wrong ground, discipline and terrain could make even the fastest army hesitate. Bjorn watched the corridor until the last banner disappeared into fog. Then, only then, he let himself settle back into the line. No triumph, no speeches. Just the steady posture of a man who understood what he'd really won. Not a decisive conquest. A pause. A delay. A crack in inevitability.
The retreat didn't explode into chaos. That's the strange part. After Chagatai went down in the slush, the Mongols didn't suddenly become a panicked crowd. They were too disciplined for that. What happened was colder, and in some ways more unsettling. A controlled withdrawal began, careful and deliberate, like a machine reversing gears in a space that's too tight. Down the slope, standards dipped. Riders turned their horses one by one, not sprinting, not scattering, just moving away with the kind of caution you only see when an army has started to respect the ground under its own feet. In that narrow valley, even retreat had to be managed. Hooves scraped for traction. Horses stepped sideways, tested the ice, refused to rush where they couldn't trust the surface. And the fog helped hide it all, like the forest itself was closing a curtain. Up at the throat of the pass, Bjorn didn't move after them. He stood where he'd always stood, at the center of the wall, shield still up, posture still heavy and steady. His men stayed locked with him, arrow-bristled shields pressed edge to edge, spears kept ready but not chasing. That decision was the real victory, because pursuit is where disciplined defense turns into a scattered argument, and scattered arguments are exactly what the Mongols were built to win. Bjorn knew that if his line broke formation to chase down the slope, they'd be stepping out of the doorway and into open ground. They'd be trading their one advantage, tight terrain, for the Mongols' greatest strength, space. So Bjorn held. No cheers, no roar, no triumphant rush forward. Just silence and breathing, as if the wall itself was waiting to see whether the withdrawal was real. For a while, nobody on the Rus side seemed to believe it. Men stared down the slope into the fog as if expecting the riders to turn back again. A few shifted their weight, testing their own legs like they were surprised they still worked. You could see hands tighten on strops and spear shafts, then loosen slightly, then tighten again. Small human motions after hours of forcing themselves to be steady. And only when the last Mongol standards faded between the pines did the valley begin to feel empty. Not safe, just empty. Somewhere lower in the fog, Mongol guards clustered tightly around the place where Chagatai had fallen. You couldn't always see details, but you could read the urgency in their movements. Men supported a figure under the weight of armor, guided him toward a mount, and pulled the group back in a protective knot. It wasn't dramatic, it was practical. A commander who is injured, or simply shaken, becomes a logistical problem. Extracting him becomes the mission, and the whole unit has to reshape itself around that mission. That's when the withdrawal truly became inevitable. On the Rus side, Bjorn finally allowed the smallest release of tension, not by relaxing discipline, but by shifting it into the next phase, control after contact. He began rotating men. A tired shield bearer stepped back, another stepped forward. It happened without noise, like a well-practiced craft. A shield was passed hand to hand, a spear butt was reseated into packed snow, a strap was tightened, a helmet was adjusted back into place. These weren't heroic moments, they were the basic mechanics of survival. One defender set a shield down into the slush with real weight, and it sank slightly before settling. Another man bent carefully, slow, heavy, restricted by mail and cold stiff cloth, and pulled a usable spear from the ground. Near the river edge, someone gathered loose arrows that could still be used. A shaft flexed as it came free from frozen earth, then straightened again in a gloved hand. The line didn't dissolve into celebration. It dissolved into work. Bjorn himself finally sat down for the first time, lowering himself against a shield like an old man who could no longer pretend his joints weren't screaming. Not collapsing, just accepting gravity. His breathing was controlled, but you could see the strain in the way his hand rested on the shield rim, the faint tremor that comes when a body stops running on pure will. A young warrior approached him, helmet slightly askew, eyes too bright with shock and relief. He spoke quickly, mouth moving without any grand gesture, like he didn't know whether to laugh or cry. The words don't matter as much as the emotion, disbelief that the enemy was truly leaving. Bjorn looked up at him and gave the smallest nod. Not a victory speech, just a confirmation. Then his eyes returned to the corridor of trees, to the fog swallowing the path, as if he were reminding himself and everyone watching that the enemy wasn't a story. The enemy was still out there.
The only reason the valley was quiet now was because it had been made too expensive to keep pushing. Behind the defenders, the frozen river sat like a hard boundary, dull silver under the sky. Cracks spidered under thin snow crust. In places, a faint milk glaze shimmered and caught the light. It was a reminder of what Bjorn had chosen. The river had been both threat and protection. No easy retreat, but also no easy encirclement. A few of Bjorn's men knelt briefly near the river edge, not as a performance, more like a moment of grounded gratitude or grief. Heads bowed, hands resting on shield rims, breath rising and vanishing. A gesture that said, in the simplest medieval way possible, "We're still here." Meanwhile, down the slope and into the trees, the Mongols continue pulling away. If you watched their movement closely, you could see the caution spread. Riders looked back over their shoulders more than they had in the morning. Horses were guided more carefully. Unit leaders signaled more often, keeping the column tight and controlled in the forest corridor. And this is where the psychological part becomes obvious. The Mongols had built their success on certainty, on the sense that they arrived and the world moved aside. But now they were leaving a place without having taken it cleanly. They were leaving behind a quiet wall that didn't chase them, didn't taunt them, didn't even try to turn their withdrawal into a rout. That kind of enemy is difficult to process. An enemy you can defeat is one thing, an enemy you can't manipulate is another. Back at the choke point, the fog thinned in patches, revealing the scarred surface of the valley, hoof prints crossing and recrossing, broken branches, arrows half buried in slush, ice patches that glittered like glass. The ground looked less like a battlefield and more like a record, an account written without ink. Bjorn rose again after a while, slowly. You could see the heaviness of armor and damp cloth pull at him as he straightened. He took a few measured steps along the line, boots sinking slightly into softened snow, moving like a man checking the integrity of a structure, because that's what his wall had been, a structure. And now that the pressure had lifted, he needed to make sure it hadn't cracked in ways he couldn't see during the crush. He exchanged a silent nod with one of his older men, an acknowledgement of cost, of exhaustion, of the strange calm after survival. No celebration, no speeches, just two veterans recognizing that the valley had asked for everything, and the line had paid. As the light faded toward late afternoon, the valley grew quieter. The last traces of smoke from smoldered shield edges drifted away and dissolved into the cold air. Cloaks fluttered gently in the wind. Breath still rose in white plumes, but slower now. And far up above the fog, a raven circled once, then disappeared into gray. Bjorn kept watching the empty corridor where the Mongols had gone, not because he expected them to return immediately, but because he understood the real nature of what had just happened. He hadn't destroyed an army. He hadn't ended an empire. He had done something smaller, and sometimes more powerful. He had made the empire hesitate. And in war, hesitation is the first crack in inevitability.
Here's the honest part most epic war stories don't like to admit. We don't get a neat, clean line in a Mongol chronicle that says, on this winter day, in this exact valley, Noyan Chagatai met Bjorn, and everything happened exactly like the legend. History doesn't usually give us that kind of footage. What we have, instead, is something messier, and in a way, more human. We have big events that are recorded clearly, and then we have the smaller moments that people remember because they felt like turning points. And those two things don't always line up perfectly. So when you hear a story like Bjorn's Stand in the Valley, you have to hold two ideas at once. One, the Mongol invasion of the Ruslands in the years leading up to 1240 is real, and it's well attested. Cities fell, whole regions were shaken, and the psychological impact traveled faster than any horse. And two, small actions, winter clashes on forest roads, standoffs at river crossings, desperate defenses in narrow passes, often live in the shadows of the record, not because they didn't matter, but because they weren't the kind of thing imperial scribes liked to carve into official memory. If you want to see how that happens, imagine two rooms. In one room, you have a monastery or a wooden hall somewhere in the north. The air smells of smoke and wax. A scribe bends over parchment in candlelight, writing in careful lines. His ink freezes if the room gets too cold, so the flame matters. He writes what people bring him, rumors, survivor accounts, names, places. Sometimes he writes what he can confirm. Sometimes he writes what the community needs to remember. In the other room, you have a Mongol camp at the edge of the forest. Low tents, horses tied in lines, a small fire guarded from the wind. Officers speak quietly, close to the flame. A record book lies on someone's knee, practical leather, nothing ornate. The empire has its own way of remembering too, but that memory has a purpose. It protects authority. It protects inevitability. And if something happens that threatens the idea of inevitability, the simplest solution is silence. Not because every Mongol commander was a liar, but because empires don't like to give their enemies stories. A blank page can be a weapon. Now, step back from those rooms and look at the map. We know the Mongols reached deep into the Ruslands. We know the major cities that fell. We also know that Novgorod, powerful, wealthy, and far to the north, was not taken in that campaign. Why? The simplest answer isn't one heroic stand. It's logistics, distance, terrain, weather, forests and marshes that slow movement.
the seasonal shift that turns roads into mud, the reality that an army can be brilliant and still be constrained by the calendar. But here's the part that legends get right, even when they decorate the details. Small actions can change big decisions, not by winning the war, but by changing the cost of movement. A narrow valley that forces an attacking force to slow down, compress, and lose its usual advantages can create delays. Delays create shortages, shortages create caution, and caution can redirect an entire campaign. That's not mythology, that's operational reality. And the most powerful part of that reality is what happens next, after the fighting stops. Because war isn't only fought on the ground, it's fought in the mind, and it travels on roads you can't patrol. After the Mongols withdrew, the valley quieted, fog drifted, frozen ruts and churned slush hardened into scars. Bjorn's men did what survivors do. They reorganized, they tightened straps, they rotated positions, they gathered arrows that could be used again, they carried equipment with heavy, tired hands. They watched the forest corridor long after the last stander disappeared, because it's hard to believe the storm has passed when you've lived under thunder. And then the story began to move. A messenger leaves a monastery yard at dusk, a sealed letter tucked into a satchel. His horse moves carefully along a snow road. The seal isn't fancy, just wax pressed by a ring, a mark that says this message matters. He rides to a wooden hall where a fire burns low, where men in fur-lined cloaks listen with the kind of stillness that means they're already doing the math in their heads. A rough map is unrolled on a table. Rivers are inclines, forests are dark smudges. Someone taps a narrow pass, maybe not Bjorn's exact valley, maybe another like it, and you can almost see the idea forming. Don't meet them in open ground. Make them fight the forest. Make them fight the river. Make them fight the doorway. That's how tactics spread in a medieval world, not through manuals, but through fear and necessity. In Novgorod, that kind of message doesn't stay inside one hall. It leaks into markets, into gatehouses, into militia yards. Guards look outward from palisade walls, and even if they never hear Bjorn's name, they feel the shift. The Mongols are not a distant story anymore. They're a question. And if the question is coming, the answer has to be prepared. So men drill with shields and spears in snowy courtyards. They practice holding, not chasing. They practice bracing. They practice stepping in unison. They hammer stakes into frozen ground near approaches. They strengthen gates. They post lookouts. Not because they believe they're invincible, but because belief is contagious, and so is panic. This is where modern eyes can learn something. We like to imagine medieval warfare as raw emotion, but what you're seeing here is something that would be familiar to any modern planner: adaptation, learning from about silence. Silence in the face of intimidation. Silence that refused the bait. Silence that held a line in a narrow place long enough to change an enemy's calculation. In the end, empires may choose what they write down, but they don't always get to choose what people remember. And in the forests of the north, memory travels the way wind travels, through every narrow pass, where a small force can become a door that will not open.
When you pull back far enough, the valley looks almost harmless. A thin scar in the snow, a narrow throat between dark pines, a frozen river looping behind it like a silver belt. In the winter of 1240, it was just one of 1,000 places in the northern forests where the world narrowed, and men had to decide whether they would move or hold. But that's the point. History doesn't always pivot on grand walls or famous cities. Sometimes it pivots on a piece of terrain so ordinary that it would never earn a name until someone turns it into a weapon. Bjorn understood that before the first arrow flew. From a modern perspective, his stand wasn't a miracle, and it wasn't a romantic last stand in the way legends like to frame it. It was a cold, professional idea. If you can't defeat the enemy's strength, you deny the conditions that make that strength possible. The Mongols needed space. They needed room to breathe, to widen, to bend the battlefield around their opponent. They needed open ground that let their horses move the way their doctrine was built to move. And they needed enemies to react, chase, scatter, break into individuals. So Bjorn offered Chagatai the one fight the steppe system hated: a doorway. A valley too narrow for wide arcs, forest too tight for clean flanks, a slope that compressed a mounted push into a crowded lane, and a frozen river behind his own line, dangerous if he had to retreat, yes, but also an anchor that made encirclement harder. If you're thinking like a modern planner, you can hear the logic immediately. Shape the battle space, reduce the enemy's options, and make every meter forward feel like a bill that must be paid. That's what Bjorn did. And Chagatai, for all the power and success behind him, was forced to fight in a way that felt wrong, not because he lacked skill, because the environment refused to cooperate with his preferred method. In the end, the valley didn't destroy an army. That isn't how most real battles work. What it did was something that can be even more disruptive. It interrupted momentum. It made the Mongol advance hesitate. And hesitation is dangerous for an empire built on the myth of inevitability. That myth, more than any bow or horse, was the Mongols' most effective weapon. The idea that they arrived and the world moved aside. The idea that resisting only made things worse. The idea that the outcome had already been decided. Bjorn attacked that idea the only way a small force realistically can. He imposed cost. He made the road feel expensive enough that the next decision, whether to push forward, whether to detour, whether to risk another narrow corridor, was no longer automatic. Now, think about Chagatai's side for a moment. It's easy to paint him as a villain in a story like this, but if you look at him through a modern lens, he's something else. A commander caught between doctrine and terrain, between pride and logistics, between the empire's narrative and the forest's reality. He didn't come into that valley expecting a mystery. He expected a routine. A small force in the way, quickly cleared, the column moving on. Instead, he found a line that refused to react like normal prey. A silence that wouldn't answer intimidation, a shield wall that wouldn't chase, a commander who didn't bargain with fear. That kind of enemy doesn't just cost you time, it costs you certainty. And once certainty starts slipping, even the most disciplined soldiers begin scanning the world for explanations, charms, curses, bad ground, bad omens, anything that explains why the usual rules are failing. That's why stories like this spread. Not because everyone agrees on every detail, but because the psychological impact is real. It changes how people think. It changes how commanders choose routes. It changes how scouts report danger. After the valley, the north didn't suddenly become safe. The Mongol threat didn't evaporate, but the shape of resistance changed. In wooden halls and monastery rooms, people turned rumor into doctrine, not through formal manuals, but through repeated lessons. Don't chase into open ground. Hold the choke points. Make forests and rivers do part of the fighting for you. Deny the enemy the space he needs. Treat terrain as a partner, not a backdrop. You can picture it happening. A rough map unrolled on a table, rivers drawn as inclines, forests as dark smudges, a finger tapping a narrow pass, a quiet conversation that becomes a local plan, then militia drills in a snowy yard, stakes driven into frozen ground near a gate approach, scouts on snowshoes moving along tree lines, listening for hoofbeats. That's what adaptation looks like in a medieval world.
Not high theory, practical repetition. And you can also picture the other side. A Mongol camp in winter, low fires guarded from wind, officers speaking quietly. The official record might stay clean, because empires don't like documenting the moments that make them look vulnerable, but soldiers remember anyway. Soldiers carry caution in their hands. They tighten loads, they check footing, they look longer into trees, their tempo changes. Even if the empire refuses to write it down, the experience still lives in the chain of command, passed from one veteran to another, from one scouting report to the next. That's the deeper reason the valley matters. Not because it ended anything, but because it introduced a new variable into the Mongol calculation, restrictive terrain where mobility becomes a liability instead of an advantage. If you want to translate Bjorn's stand into a modern takeaway, it's this. Small forces don't always win by destroying bigger forces. Often they win by shaping costs, making a route too risky, a delay too damaging, a push too uncertain. That's why special operations, defensive doctrine, and modern battlefield planning still revolve around the same fundamentals Bjorn used without naming them. Control space, control tempo, protect cohesion, deny the enemy his preferred fight. Bjorn's brilliance wasn't that he was louder or fiercer or more dramatic. It was that he stayed organized when everything in the human body screams to break formation. And perhaps the most important decision he made that day came after the turning point. He didn't chase. He held. That choice is what kept the victory from unraveling, because pursuit would have turned his wall into a crowd, carried exhausted men onto open ground, and handed Chaghatay's riders the kind of fight they could still win. Instead, Bjorn let the Mongols leave with their fear intact. He let them carry the memory out of the valley and into the forest. And that's how the myth of inevitability starts to crack, not with a parade, but with a withdrawal that feels unfamiliar. If you imagine the final shot of this story, it isn't a triumphant banner planted on a hill. It's wider than that. A frozen river winding through endless pine forests toward distant wooden towns and church domes under a pale sky. Small figures moving along palisade walls, gates reinforced, spears stacked, scouts watching narrow paths. Life continuing, but with new awareness. And somewhere in that landscape, a valley sits quiet, fog rolling through it like a slow breath, holding the marks of a day when the math of conquest met something the step system couldn't easily solve. Not magic, not destiny, just terrain, discipline, and a commander who understood that sometimes the only way to stop a storm is to force it into a doorway.